I've been getting asked a lot lately about leather and just more information on how to choose it and where to buy it and what to get. So I thought I'd make a little video just to deep dive this topic a little bit more. So let's just dive straight in. The first thing to consider is that although I talk a lot about making sure you choose the right thickness, like 1.5 to 2 mil, it is important, but it is less about thickness and more about stretchiness. So with that in mind, if you're making, let's say, sandal straps and they're going to be unlined or unstitched, you're going to want to get a leather with almost no stretch at all to it. So you want to be able to sort of pull it like that and have pretty much no movement whatsoever. If you're making shoes, then of course you do want some stretch because you need to be able to pull it over the last and stretch it around there. So stretch is really important, especially when you're doing pleating around the toes. When doing boots, stretch is important as well, but you probably want to get a leather that's maybe slightly more sturdy, and that's just so that you have a nice structure when you're building a boot. Really, when I talk about thickness, the reason I'm saying that is because if you go too thick, maybe your home domestic sewing machine might not stitch through the leather. So yeah, although you should keep thickness in mind, don't get too stuck on it. I can show you, I've got a range of different leathers here. They are all different thicknesses, different weights, different stretchiness. So I would use them for different things. But with that in mind, I could make a boot and a shoe using the same leather. It just might give a different look. I've just got some points here to make sure I don't forget anything, so I'll go through those. A couple of pros and cons, I guess, with using a thicker leather versus a thinner leather is that a thicker leather will hide pretty much all the mistakes that you make under the shoe. So let's say, for example, you don't get your toe puff or counter stiffener perfectly smooth. There's a few lumps and bumps. Usually a thicker leather will just hide that and you'll never know. A thinner leather does, on the other hand, show up everything from the layer underneath. So you really want to make sure that you don't have baggy lining or your stiffeners aren't in perfectly or something, because a thinner leather will show that up. So I've still got a few other points that I want to talk about. Let's talk about buying leather. I always say if you can do it in person, it's best. You want to try and avoid leathers that, unless you're making sandals, that are with zero stretch or that are kind of crunchy, I suppose. Something with no stretch is pretty much only good for sandals or for making shoes or boots in a factory setting where you've got heavy duty machinery. One really great tip is that if you are in a leather shop, you want to take a piece of leather and just sort of stretch it over your last and make sure that it does stretch in a way that smooths. If you don't have your last with you, you can always do it over your hand like that to make sure that it is quite a malleable piece. If you can't get to a leather shop in person, you just want to sort of ask on the phone or via email what the properties of the leather are, and pretty much all you want to know is, does it have any stretch, how stiff is it, and what's the weight really. But don't get put off by whatever the weight is. Leather is normally priced per square foot, so you can't walk into a leather shop and say, can I get a meter of that? It doesn't work that way, and you'll probably get laughed out of the store. You have to buy the whole piece. So try and find leathers that are small pieces. You could get leathers anywhere between £10 and £100 depending on the size, the quality, the finish, etc., etc. Always, always, always check for marks. So you want to really open the piece out and just make sure that there are no imperfections or marks all over the piece. Usually in the leather shop you can actually pick out the piece that you want to buy. Alright, so when it comes to lining, you can use pretty much anything for lining as well, but just think about how you're balancing the weight of the leathers you're putting together. So for example, if you're using a really thin upper leather, then maybe you want to balance that with a slightly thicker lining. We always tend to use a lambskin lining in I Can Make shoes just because it's really nice and soft, easy to work with. But you can use anything you want really. So there's obviously alternatives to leather as well. So you can use fabrics or you can get faux leathers like this one here. Now, faux leather is actually a really great place to start. They've got a good stretch, much cheaper. You can buy them per meter. The one thing about using a faux leather though is that it can be quite difficult to work with in terms of the glue. I always tend to use the stronger glue, which we use for attaching soles, for the whole process when I'm using a faux leather. It does tend to just sort of soak into the fabric side quite a bit more, so it just doesn't behave in the same way that a real leather would. So same sort of thing goes if you're just going to use a fabric or a material. It's too thin on its own to make shoes, but I would always recommend ironing on a interfacing, and that will just stiffen it up a little bit and give it a bit more rigidity for a shoe. Same thing goes, I'll usually always use the stronger glue though when I'm working with fabrics. Okay, so the last thing I want to do before I sign off is show you some of the leathers I have here and just show you in person what I mean when I'm talking about stretchiness. So I'm actually going to start with this piece here, which is actually veg tan leather. We use this for sandal straps and it's got barely any stretch at all in any direction. So I would not be making shoes or boots out of this. I have got this one here, and actually I just finished a pair of boots out of this on the boot making course. It doesn't have a huge amount of stretch, but you can see if I pull it, it is stretching quite a bit. So I can see that it's stretchy, but still it's got kind of a good sturdiness to it. It doesn't just sort of collapse down on its own when I hold it like that. So that's good for boots, that one. This one I also made boots out of, but you can see it's much softer in that way. Certainly has quite a decent amount of stretch to it. So you could do definitely shoes out of this, but it's great for boots as well. Back here is a boot which is made right out of that leather. Alright, so here's another leather that I've got hanging up. You can see straight away just by the way that it holds itself that it's got a nice sturdiness, which means it would be great for a boot. This one does have a really nice stretch to it as well though, so I would be quite happy making a pair of shoes out of that leather. You can see how these leathers are all sort of behaving a little bit differently, but they're all totally suitable. Here I've got a suede, which actually feels a bit thick. Split suedes often are thicker, but they're really stretchy and really floppy. So that could be quite nice for a shoe, boot, lining, anything like that. This is a lambskin, really, really nice and stretchy. This is often what I would use for a lining, but in this color I would make the upper for a shoe out of that. It might be a little on the stretchy thin side for doing a boot because you can see it really does have quite a lot of stretch there, but for a shoe that would be absolutely perfect. Another top tip when you're in a leather shop, if you take the corner of a piece of leather and just stretch it out, if the color cracks and sort of comes away, you want to avoid that piece of leather, because what happens when you're actually lasting the shoe around the toe is that you're stretching it in different directions, so you don't want the color to crack away. So make sure that when you're stretching it like that, it remains the same color. Okay, well I hope that's been helpful. Any other questions, just let us know.